I'm going to talk about supply chain processes also in similar way to what Des was babbling about yesterday. Some of these are some of the basic tools that you need at your fingertips to understand what's going on. So some of these things like push, pull, agile, lean, etc. will come back time and time again as we go right through. And as we look a little bit later on at some of the more interesting supply chains like healthcare and other service supply chains. So I'm going to look at process views and theories of the supply chain, assess push and pull and postpone views of configuration, and look at lean and agile and separate those out a little bit because they're not the same. Okay, now we can look at a supply chain more or less of a process as cycles, where the supply chain can be viewed as a series of internal organizational cycles from each of those components. If you remember last time I talked about way back to the, let's say, the raw material type of production, the basic materials, via manufacturers, to distribution, all the way out to retail, if that part is no direct deliveries, and to us. We don't count so much. You can see in each of those particular components in the supply chain, certain core processes which take place, which is quite important for us to think about. Push supply chain based on the anticipation of demand. Yeah, so I'm just going to define these, and they're also on flashcards. So push strategies based on an anticipation of demand. What do I mean about that? A push strategy generally makes to a particular forecast, and so we take a view of what sort of product or service we're going to sell in the future, and we make before the demand is actually crystallized in the form of an actual order. So we're producing more or less for stock. Now in those types of supply chain, the key things we need to think about is how we manage that forecast and how we minimize the stock that we necessarily create with such an approach. So it's, there's usually some sort of fancy demand forecast. So it's determined by a demand forecast. Somebody sits down and when I work in commercial, we make a sales plan going forward for usually 1-2 years hence in monthly buckets, monthly time periods. This is what we expect to sell of that particular product type in that period, and that gets translated into a production plan. Lots of troubles here. And so our prediction is always uncertain, and as a result of uncertainty, we tend to carry more stock to cover those uncertainties, and how we're going to manage that we'll talk about a little bit later on. So it's demand forecast, it's about the future, it's inherently risky, and so it's inherently uncertain. There is variability in the environment always going on in the background. Pull supply chains, on the other hand, in principle, try to only react, only generate an order based on an actual customer demand. Yeah? In principle, you make an order, then say, we've got an order with the exact specification you want, therefore we'll make it for you. And so no demand, and we respond to an order. What's the risk in that type of approach?
Not being able to respond.
Correct.
To the demand.
Because of those issues. That you go there, can I have that product? Sorry, it's out of stock. Well, it is no stock. Sorry, you have to wait 6 to 8 weeks. Right? So they had stock. And so one of the things about a push type strategy, your response to the customer order tends to be quite good. Yeah? And so you have stock, you've got to control the level of stock, obviously. You don't want too much, as later on we'll see it's going to cost you a big bag of money, but you're able to respond more or less immediately to a customer order. Whereas, is that the case for a pull strategy? Perhaps not. There is always an inherent risk that, that it's just nothing there, or there's a delay, lead time issues, and so on, that we have to cope with. And I think more and more we're going to this sort of hybrid approach where some stock is held in the supply chain such that we have something so we can deliver, but we only react to the last delivery, if you will, when we physically have got an order and payment in our hands. Yeah? Come to that in a minute. Hybrid push-pull. Push based on demand forecast for low uncertainty. So it tends to be push, building for stock. Demand forecast works rather well for steady state types of product, bread, eggs, consumer staples. Standard products which we use all the time tend to have, in a deterministic way, a very predictable profile. We can work it out. Ice cream sales, you can work those out quite well based on weather forecasts and all the rest of it. You know when you're going to sell a particular product reasonably well. So push based on demand forecast where there is relatively low uncertainty for the product. And I put an example there for incorporated common parts and components. For example, back in the TV manufacturing days, way back, when they used to have these big CRT screens, that a lot of the key components were very similar. IF chips, which are intermediate frequency chips, which you used to have in TV sets in a decoder, were basically all the same for all of the types of models which were produced by Philips at that time. Yeah? So a standard common product which you could more or less predict very well on your overall program. What was more difficult was to predict the actual type executions. What that type execution is, it means the specific customized last piece of the puzzle which makes that product exactly that one. That last piece tends to be where all the variability is in. So push-based demand forecast, relatively low uncertainty, especially for incorporated common part. Okay, and the last bit, hybrid push-pull, I'll just finish off on that. And the final finished product with a final configuration or the customization, that's usually on pull. That's usually based on the specific demand. I'm not sure if they're going to take you up to see one of the car manufacturers in the UK, BMW went last year. And yeah, the fancy wheels, for example, and tyres, and yeah, all of the little tweaks and fancy headlights and the rest of it. There's one fancy one there, plain one there, and they just, very last, literally before they drove it off the production line, they did the last few tweaks to make it. Other than that, it was more or less identical. Yeah. So it's, but it's a good strategy. We get what we want. We have the colours we want. We get the colours. We get the fancy tweaks to make it more personalised, and so we're happy with that. But it is basically the same product, for sure. And in each of these major chunks, and I've stylized it a little bit because it's obviously a lot more systems and processes going on inside any sort of decent organization. But if I can just work my way back through the supply chain using this. So here are the orders. And so in principle, we should feel the orders right. So orders get felt all the way along the supply chain in principle, from the customer via the retailer. So there's some sort of customer order cycle which is going on there. Point of sale information is going back. We're making the sale. We're taking it off the shelf of the retailer in this particular example. Then the retailer will execute a replenishment order, and I've put it on the distributor. It can be the distributor, or in more complicated supply chains, directly back to the manufacturer, or even the core suppliers in terms of retail consumables. So the customer order cycle is the main thing going on at the front end, and we need to look for it. Distributors, they take in goods from manufacturers and core suppliers, and they package it, they assort it. Usually they consolidate shipments from different manufacturers. So not all manufacturers will go to a Sainsbury's. They'll go via a consolidation warehouse where the distributor will take the baked beans from here and the sauerkraut from there and all this sort of stuff, put it together in one package, and then deliver it off to Sainsbury's. So there's a whole load of replenishment cycles based on what they deliver to their customers, the retailers. Then they will kick off orders to their various manufacturers or suppliers. Yeah? So for them, the replenishment cycle is the main part of their operational systems. And manufacturing cycles, I will go into that a little bit of detail both those two in the middle on this course. I'm particularly interested in those two, the replenishment, how we manage orders and stock right throughout each step of the supply chain is a critical issue. Because before you know it, you can have stock all over the place. So these are very important processes to get absolutely right. And all the way back to procurement processes, right at the back end, sales and purchase processed in that one. And what I'm suggesting here, and a bit more detail in a second, that more or less, if you look at the back end of this process, the suppliers and the manufacturers and the creation of the product, they tend to have an orientation towards building for stock. Yeah? So more a push strategy. It's not entirely the case, but more or less a push strategy. You can say, right, that end, we're going to build stock to be able to respond to orders from the front end. And certainly in more modern supply chains, we have this situation where the pull comes, obviously in a retailer's case. Typical replenishment cycle. Sale is made to a customer, recorded in the point of sale system, updates the local store inventory management system. Each of them have very, very sophisticated systems to manage the shelves. They'll kick off when it falls below a preset minimum, and that can be quite low. This may be the main depot, so all that means is that store inventory falls below a certain level, and they may have a back end, their own location where they hold all the stock and say, send some more to us. An order pick list is generated and the goods for the store are picked and docked. And the computer generates a shipping and consignment note, and the goods are sent out on a given trip. So there's a lot of paperwork, funny enough, not real paperwork, but virtual paperwork as well, takes place in what looks like a relatively simple process. So push-pull, just to recap, push processes, relatively low uncertainty. I would suggest relatively long lead times as well, and so cost minimization types of ideas come to the fore here. Make sense? Yeah. Reduce the cost, at least manage the cost as much as you can, and so stock costs a lot of money, as we'll see later on. And so to minimize it, keep it under control is particularly important. So, and thinking back to what Des was talking about yesterday, that part of the chain very much focused on, let's take the costs out, let's eliminate the waste, let's stop work in progress, let's reduce movements, and so resource allocation is all about, that's all about resource allocation. Now, pull processes, so I'll come to that line in a minute. Relatively high uncertainty in the demand. Relatively short. I suggest relatively short cycle times overall. But broadly, short cycle times. Service level and responsiveness is key to do all that. So responsiveness is the key in pull processes. Managing efficient resource allocation is the important thing in terms of push type strategies. That's a broad distinction between the two. Most supply chains tend to be a little bit of a mix of the two, as it happens. Now, boundary, okay, back to that thing. This here is a boundary. Now, the boundary is where the inventory, or inventory itself, decouples manufacturing and customer cycles. If I go back to wherever it was there, we have these are more or less customer cycles, if I can call them that here. And here's the production type cycles, the making the stuff on the right-hand side. Or I'm suggesting at this point here, roughly speaking here, this boundary, that's where, and this one's repeated here, that's where inventory is placed to decouple the two sections of the supply chain. And why that is, I'll come to in a second. Now, so the push part of the supply chain, broadly speaking, making the stuff, and producing it. Supply chain planning processes, obviously. Longer term strategies. Pull part of the supply chain, as I mentioned, is more of an order fulfillment. We are responding to our customer orders, the bottom line, for the front half of the supply chain. Buffer inventory is usually at the boundaries and is the output of the tactical planning process. So We put it there. Here's our material. We've made it. There it is, sitting in stock in some location, and it's the input to the order fulfillment. That's the stock from which I'm going to draw in order to fulfill the customer order. We can put the location, the push-pull, or where the breakpoint is. For example, a Waitrose, a typical retailer, carries, their daily pull, and most of the push-type strategy is on the other side. It's with the prime manufacturers, with the prime suppliers, the manufacturers, the distributors, and all the rest of it is all down on the left-hand side as far as a Waitrose is concerned. And so they decouple it quite late in the supply chain. They pull directly from basically the distribution. Whereas a Dell, I would suggest anyway, that the decoupling point for Dell, from the example we saw last week, is more or less at the assembly point. At that point, Dell take components, assemblies, motherboards, and the rest of it, and they put it together in those totes in that manufacturing process we saw to make the final product. So the inventory, the decoupling point between the pull and the push type of approach is more or less at the assembly point. Whereas if you look at somebody like Ryan Furniture, we'll meet them a little bit later on, more or less they make an individual item of furniture on demand, yeah, and so they're making it, and so the actual order gets all the way back to the the physical manufacturing process. Now, if you look at that sort of, who do you think is carrying the inventory risk? The thing moves from right to left. So if you look at Dell, who's carrying the inventory risk there? This business about what is meant by uncertainty. Why is the graph, let's say, on the right-hand side of the chart up there, a little bit uncertain? So it's variable. And that's what I mean by uncertainty. We cannot really be absolutely certain when an individual customer order will come in. There's two classes here, so I apologize if I said anything which was more confusing than normal. I'm just going to look at this production. Make to stock and make to order. Make to stock. And so this looks at the manufacturing, somebody raised it earlier on, looks at the manufacturing perspective. Make to stock production technique proceeds against a forecasted aggregated pan of customer demand, what I just said. So there is an aggregated forecast of what we're going to sell to end consumers or end businesses in the future against each stock control unit in the product portfolio. And there can be hundreds of stock control units in a typical factory. So production proceeds against a forecasted aggregated plan of the demand for each stock control unit in the portfolio. And there is some forecast to actual demand variability, especially for the mix. So the forecast for an actual Mondeo might be fairly okay. We know, roughly speaking, how many Mondeos we're going to sell in a month, in a year. But whether or not they're going to have a special all singing, all dancing Mondeo with fancy wheels, sat nav, and all the rest of it is not so well known. So we tend to find in manufacturing processes that there still remains a lot of variability in the specific items that we have to produce. Make to order, production follows an actual order demand on the factory. That's relatively straightforward, yeah? So you wait until a real order is received from a customer before you do anything. Furniture manufacturer, for example, Ryan Furniture on the bottom end there, particularly for bespoke, customized furniture, or you want a particular lining, covers on it, would wait until you've paid the deposit before they start making it for you. Yeah, so that's a case where it's a buy to order situation. They're not going to do anything. They make a purchase, then the order is real. So production in their case, in the furniture manufacturer, tends to follow an individual order in that case if it's bespoke furniture. Push component is to make the stock production perspective, as somebody mentioned earlier on. Products are carried in inventory to fulfill immediate demand, and the operation produces inventory in advance of the actual demand in order to have stock ready to to meet an order. So make to stock approach. The critical supply chain tasks, where we start to get a bit real, are forecasting. If you're going to produce to stock based on some sort of demand, there are very sophisticated tools and techniques. I will touch on one or two of them as we go through, which some of you may use in the future to do just this job, to work out what our demand forecast is going to look like. So operation produces inventory and is based on forecasting. Inventory management is obvious, that if you're making to stock, you just can't let it run. You have to control and manage it. Stock costs up to 20-25% annualized in a year, just to hold in insurance, the building, the people managing the stock and all the rest of it. It costs a lot of money. So obviously we really need to think about how we're going to control and maintain control over it. And obviously capacity planning. How much capacity do we need to produce a particular production plan over to make the stock characteristics of mass production. And so with my little customer down here, customer makes a physical order on the retailer, and the retailer then bumps out the product more or less directly to the customer. Production makes the product to send to the retailer based on a call-off order. So the retailer will place an order on production or the supplier, the manufacturer, to send me some more stuff. That production is based on a planning system. This is obviously very simplistic, but it's based on a planning system which makes a production schedule based on a forecast, as I said before. So there's a forecast, a prediction based on usually historic demand. What will the demand look like in the future based on what we have done already? So production geared to forecast orders and replenishment of inventory. So there's a stock point, we cover it later, where we will hold a defined amount of inventory that we will need in order to meet our predicted demand uncertainty. So demand is a little bit uncertain, so that inventory, that buffer stock, has to be there to cope with the uncertainty further up the chain. Performance measures, typically replenishment time. How quickly can you replace a product once sold? So how long does it take the manufacturer to send the product to you when you sold it? And that just doesn't include things like the shipping time, the order processing time, the agreement, the invoicing process, and all that stuff has to kick around as well. Somebody has to physically make that order. All of that stuff is the actual replenishment time it takes to make an order. Inventory turnover, that's quite an important parameter. That's how many times the inventory turns over in a particular period. And capacity utilization is also very, very important. The appropriate use of the capacity you have there. And that can vary a lot. Capacity utilization, you have a factory that can produce 1,000 TV sets, and you've actually planned production of 800. Your utilization is relatively equal to 80% of that capacity. So that capacity at the top is lost. And you want to reduce that lost capacity as much as you can. Make to order is a characteristic of mass customization. Make to order process, individual orders are usually identified and tracked during production, or can be. And so a physical order comes in and the final product gets pumped out through the door. And cycle production, procurement, order replenishment, and it only begins once we have a tagged order. It's actually known, but an order which is identified for a particular customer or client location. And manufacturing throughput time or orders completed on time are some of the key measures. At a simplistic level, make to stock offers greater flexibility, higher forecast and planning effort. Obviously, that's the issue. Inventory levels are very, very important. We'll cover that in spades later on. Tends to be lower flexibility, higher inventory and work in progress tends to come with it. And so a lot of techniques in this type of operation to get this under some sort of control. Yeah? and relatively lower production costs, economies of scale start coming in here. And key metrics is service level. Lower forecast, and so on pull type strategies, make to order, lower forecast and planning effort, because you're not planning. Well, planning, that's not true. But on the manufacturing side, you're planning, but on the order side, you don't have to plan this much, you just give it to them. It's a replenishment type of process. It's keyed on the order, relatively higher flexibility, so it can react quickly. Tends to be lower inventory cost, at least on that side, because you're not carrying. Ideal, a full pull situation, more or less, not carrying any inventory, except maybe a bit of shelf stock and stuff like that, and that would be it. Relatively higher production cost, because you don't have the economies of scale. You are trying to be a little bit more flexible, and so you tend to have to pay for that with a bit more money. And response time, obviously, is the key thing about pull type of approaches. You want to be able to react quickly. We're very impatient. Business to business is no different really. That they tend to want a relatively fast reaction as well. They want to replace things fairly quickly. If you're in a service industry and you're repairing photocopiers or repairing any kit inside another company, reaction time is very, very important to get out there and fix things quickly. For mass consumer products, white or brown goods, white goods washing machines, brown goods TV sets and that sort of stuff. Customer demand is aggregated to form the master production schedule, which we'll all learn to love and respect a little bit later on. That is relatively difficult to change. Once you've made a schedule, this plan of what you're going to make for the next 6 months, split in monthly buckets, it's quite difficult to change it. Now, it's actually physically easy to change. You just sit at a computer screen, key in a new plan. But what happens is when you make your master production schedule, that gets translated into a materials plan, i.e. orders, which you place on your suppliers to deliver goods. And they'll kick off their production processes. So once you've made your plan, a whole lot of things start happening in the background as well, which has a lot of inertia, and it's very, very difficult to stop things happening. And when you change a production plan too quickly and too rapidly, this can cause absolute chaos in the supply chain. Absolute chaos. This can overcome by postponement, which I'm going to cover that in a few seconds. Assemble to order is a hybrid of make to order and make to stock. Works on the theory of modularization and postponement. So modularization, components like the motherboard, for example, or the chassis and stuff like that. So that's modularizing particular parts of the product. And postponement relatively simply means we wait until the last possible minute in the supply chain to finish the product specifically for the client. That can be at the actual manufacturing location, or it can even be in a third or fourth party logistics operation. They can even do the last piece of packaging and putting it together. So that's an idea of postponement, waiting to the last possible minute to finish things off. And just as make to stock carries inventory, it carries it but as components. So this is the classic Dell situation. So they carry, or not them personally, but there are stocks of components ready to be assembled, modules like a hard disk, which is more or less a complete component, which you can put into any product in their case, is an assembly which is complete and ready to be put into the finished product exactly when the order is received. So if you want a 1 terabyte disk, then that is just pulled off shelf and plugged into your particular configuration. So a bit of a hybrid between the two. A production manager, asserts that making products to order in a factory makes production processes inefficient and unsustainable. Do you think it's necessarily true? That's all the clue I'm giving.